Um, Hi, my name is Jaspal, yeah, it's my great honor to introduce to you Gerald Roche, who's going to be our first speaker for in this iteration of the Open DiscourseNet seminar London. So thank you so much, Gerald, for agreeing to speak to us today. Gerald is in Australia, I believe, so it's pretty late where you are. I'm sure thank you for making time in your evening to speak to us today about a very important and interesting topic, namely language and the politics of death. I think that's the title of your talk. And Gerald is an anthropologist, a linguistic anthropologist, I would say. Maybe he's associate professor in the Department of Politics, Media, and Philosophy at La Trobe University in Australia. And he's also the co-chair of the Global Coalition of Language Rights. And his work has been in the area of language revitalization, language and the state, language and colonialism, and race, particularly in Asia and in the transnational Himalayan region, for instance, in Tibet. His most recent book, I can't remember the name now, I should have written this down, is going to come out very, very soon. And it's about you can tell the audience.
I'll tell you about it in the talk.
Right, so. Great. And it is about language revitalization in Tibet and the politics of oppression. In fact, Gerald has published widely in all the journals and written extensively about necropolitics, about linguistic human rights, about language oppression. And nationalism and related topics. And we are very, very excited that he's agreed to speak to us today, partly about his new book and present to us language and the politics of death. Over to you, Gerald, please. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for that generous introduction. Thanks also for the invitation to speak to everyone. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you all as we get through the talking part and get into the chatting part. I'm going to share my screen. Hope that it doesn't sort of explode or anything.
Yeah, and while you're doing this, Gerald, let me just say one more thing. Feel free to use the chat box, or you should have a little chat window to just react to whatever Gerald is saying, and also feel free to use the Q&A box to ask questions during the talk, and we will pick that up after the talk. Thank you.
Great. So can everyone see the screen? Okay, you can all see Barbie?
Yes, we can see Barbie. Perfect.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'm going to aim to speak for about 30-40 minutes. I don't have a scripted talk, but I'll try to keep it sort of within those bounds. And then we can have a chat for the remainder. If I'm a little bit hazy and foggy, it's because it's quite late and I'm quite an early bird. But anyway, it's nice to be here and to be talking with you about language and death. Like Barbie here, we're going to be thinking about dying this evening. So this partly is to serve as a content warning, which is that I'll be talking about death and various forms of violence. So if you're not sort of feeling fortified enough right now, if you're feeling vulnerable, you might want to check out and check back in later on, or have a look at some of the written texts and so on. You've got my contact information there. I'll bring that up again at the end. So if people have questions that they don't want to ask now, or something that comes to you later, you can follow up, and I welcome follow-up questions and so on. So yeah, let's follow Barbie. Let's think about dying. So first of all, just to begin, I want to start the formal talk with an acknowledgement of country, which is that I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I also want to acknowledge that the site where I am, what is today the city of Melbourne, is the site of an ongoing language struggle. It's a side of struggle for the revitalization of the Woiwurrung and Bunurong languages, which are the Indigenous languages of Melbourne and all across the land where I am. There are um, ongoing language oppression, ongoing language reclamation efforts, ongoing backlash against Indigenous languages, forming the backdrop of what I'll be talking about tonight. I also just want to note that so I'm at La Trobe University, and that university is named after Charles La Trobe, who was basically the first governing colonial official in what became the state of Victoria. He kind of oversaw the dispossession, was the chief governing official during a period of massacres and genocides. And the university's own website now even acknowledges that he played an integral role in the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their lands. So I'm opposed to the naming of the university after this person. I'm very proud to work where I do and with the people that I do to serve the students that I have. But I reject the name of the university as an appropriate person to celebrate. So you'll see in the top right-hand corner there's a QR code. I'll have QR codes scattered throughout my talk. If you want to follow through on any of the things I'm talking about, you can find some of the links there. So that link follows through to a submission that I made with several of my colleagues at La Trobe University to what's called the Europe Justice Commission, which is a Indigenous-led truth-telling commission collecting testimonies about the colonial history and its ongoing impacts here. And so we put in a submission detailing the history of Charles La Trobe and why we feel that it's no longer appropriate to have a institution of higher education named after him. So that's kind of some preambles, and we can get into the talk now. So I'm kind of just going to walk you through a narrative of my thinking about these issues around language and death, and I'm going to start where I started, which is in Tibet back in 2009. I was living on the Northeast Tibetan Plateau in 2009, and during that year, there began a series of self-immolation protests where Tibetan people were setting fire to their own bodies in protest against Chinese rule, often at the cost of their life. And so since 2009, there have been a total of 160 self-immolations. They peaked in November 2012. And during that month, there was basically one self-immolation protest every day during the entire month. So this was a quite dramatic thing to be witness to, and it was a very contended and contentious topic amongst the Tibetans that I lived and worked with at the time. So I remember being at a gathering where people were debating whether this was a good protest technique, whether it was a meaningful form of resistance. And one of the conversations gravitated to this idea of whether these people were brave or cowardly for doing what they did. And I remember someone reaching across and grabbing their interlocutor's hand and pulling out a cigarette lighter and holding it underneath their hand and saying, well, answer the question now whether you think these people are courageous or cowardly while your hand is to the fire. Tell me what you think of these people now. So it's quite a striking thing to witness, and a lot of the people who immolated left testimonies, and in an analysis of the testimonies quite early on, this Tibetan writer and dissident, Tsering Rosa, she came to the conclusion that the preservation of the Tibetan language is a central concern of these self-immolators. They were leaving behind in their written testimonies statements about their desire to protect the Tibetan language. So this is where I started thinking about these links between language and death, and trying to understand what is it that would make someone want to die for their language. And when I started looking further into this, these were not isolated cases. So a handful of other cases of language protests leading to death. So we see, for example, 1952 in India, 1964 in India, 2019. In Russia, we have these other protests. But then looking more broadly, I started to see other forms of entanglement between language and death. So Calvet has this great phrase in his book Language Wars, where he talks about shibboleths of death, where people are killed on the basis of some minor feature of language that reveals an aspect of their identity. And we see examples of this in the Cambodian genocide. We see this in Burundi, in the killing between Hutu and Tutsi. We see this in South Sudan. There's numerous examples that you can find in the literature on genocide and mass atrocities. So we have another kind of layer linking language and death. And then a third connection that we find is that in the literature on language revitalization and Indigenous language maintenance, we find numerous studies reporting over the last 30 years that language is a source of life as well, that revitalizing and using Indigenous languages improves well-being, improves health, and so on. And so I started to get curious and think about, how can we think about all of these disparate facts together? How can we theorize a connection between language and life, language and death? And that's kind of what I'm going to talk you through. So thinking specifically about the relationship between, well, why some people would kill themselves in defense of a language, one of the sources which I found most helpful in thinking through this issue was this work by Banu Bargu, Starve and Immolate, where she talks about the politics of what she calls human weapons. She looks at self-immolation protests and starvation protests, and she characterizes them as what she calls necro-resistance, so death resistance, forms of resistance based on self-destructive practices. And the way that she talks about this is that she sees necro-resistance as being strategic, as being tactical. It's essentially attacks the state's power at its most intimate level, which is the capacity to decide when someone dies and whether they live or not. And she sees these necro-resistance as being essentially about wresting that power back from the state. And so reading Bargu's work led me into a broader literature on biopolitics, which some of you might be aware of, which was developed in Michel Foucault's published work in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, but more extensively in his lectures, and particularly these 3 series of lectures that you can see here, and has led to this quite enormous, extensive literature on the relationship between power, life, and death, which is sort of the theoretical underpinning of the perspective that I developed, which I'll get towards a little bit later on. But just to be clear, I'm not really going to delve into the theoretical dimensions of this very, very deeply, but I just want to sort of say that it's there, and we can come back to it in the questions if people are interested in it. So this set me off on kind of theorizing the link between language and death and understanding why people might die in defense of a language. At the same time, though, in addition to sort of a theoretical understanding, I was looking for cases for comparison that would help me think through what was going on in this situation and the way that those self-immolation protests were linked to the broader politics of language in Tibet. So one of the first works that sort of helped me to start thinking through this issue is this book, The Physiology of Sexist and Racist Oppression, where Shannon Sullivan looks at the bodily, physiological impacts of essentially white supremacy and misogyny as governing systems. And you can see the quote from her down the bottom there: the lived personal effects of racism and sexism can be found anywhere in the human body, in heart, stomach, intestines, chemical and hormonal attachments, as well as in the brain. So in each of the chapters in the book, she works her way through a different sort of body system and looks at the way that oppressive hierarchical social and political arrangements manifest in poor health in different parts of the body. Around the same time, I came across this other book, The Killing Fields of Inequality by Göran Thorborn, and he just states it very succinctly: inequality kills. He's looking specifically at economic inequality and increasing economic inequality as sources of divergent life expectancy. But when we look more broadly in the literature, we can see this kind of relationship between inequality and death reproduced in a number of arenas. So, for example, if we look at global economic inequalities, we see that this is strongly correlated with life expectancy. So we can see here the two lines in this graph. This is from the Our World in Data website, where on the left-hand side, this is disability adjusted life years, so number of years lost due to poor health, increases drastically with lower incomes, and then peters out on the right-hand side. And a good summary of this is from The Killing Fields of Inequality. The life expectancy gap between the rich country group and the least developed countries was 27 years in 2010. So depending on where you're born, your life expectancy will be drastically different because of the economic conditions that you are born into. But we also see that on a local scale, not just on a global scale. So, for example, in Australia, we have a well-known Indigenous life expectancy shortfall. So in Australia, the Indigenous people live between roughly 9 and 8 years less than the non-Indigenous population of the country. Another example of this we see in India. Studies there have found a similar relationship between inequality and death. So scheduled castes, here we're talking about basically Dalits or formerly untouchables. Scheduled tribes, we're talking about the Adivasi or Indigenous people, and taken together, when those populations are compared with high caste individuals, they on average live roughly 4.2 for women and up to 7 years less than men. So across different contexts, different populations, we see inequality being linked to forms of death. That's what I'm getting at. And this is summarized by Dr. David Ansel in his book, The Death Gap. Here, inequality triggers so many causes of premature death that we need to treat inequality as a disease and eradicate it, just as we would seek to halt any epidemic. And so looking through all of this literature, I basically started thinking about whether or not we could think about linguistic inequalities as being a source of death. Not only a source of death in that sort of the immediate bodily destruction that we see in those self-immolation protests, but if there was behind that, there was a broader inequality of life expectancy that correlates with the political inequality that linguistically marginalized populations face. And so I sort of put together a theoretical justification for this in this article, The Necropolitics of Language Oppression, which was published in the Annual Review of Anthropology back in 2022. Now, what this isn't is it's not an empirical study. It's not a statistical study. I don't yet have the numerical data that would show that sort of linguistically minoritized individuals die prematurely compared to linguistic majorities. But what I tried to do in this was to build a strong case to argue that we should expect to see this. We should expect to see that linguistic inequalities also translate to what I sometimes call bio inequalities, inequalities of life expectancy and so on. So a lot of the article is building up the theoretical framework about the relationship between the state and the production of death and so on. What I really want to focus on is the more substantive part of the article, where I kind of try and justify why I think it is that linguistic minorities would die prematurely compared to the general population. And I make two basic articles. So one basic arguments. One is that linguistic minorities, linguistically minoritized people and populations face all sorts of discrimination in their day-to-day life. So I'm thinking about, for example, things like accentism, exposure to testimonial injustice, disparagement, humor, sort of day-to-day interactive discrimination in their everyday life on the basis of language. So we know that this kind of discrimination is linked to chronic stress, and we have a wide range of biomedical literature that links chronic stress to reduced lifespan. And there's a biological mechanism for this, centering on the telomeres, which is a structure on the end of a chromosome. And basically, the phenomenon is known as weathering. In populations that experience chronic stress due to discrimination, we find that they have an average genetic age which is much older than their actual calendar age, as a result of this kind of physiological impact at a molecular level. So I can talk a little bit more about that if people are interested, but basically we know that discrimination links to stress. Stress causes molecular changes that lead the body to age prematurely, to experience disease with greater vulnerability and susceptibility, and to die earlier. So that's one level. We know that linguistically minoritized individuals and populations will be exposed to this kind of chronic stress and the health impacts. But particularly, there's a second set beyond sort of the social dimensions of discrimination, which center around practices of exclusion. So what I'm thinking about here is that if you're unable to use your preferred language within a particular institutional context, that's what I'm talking about when I'm referring to exclusion. So, for example, in education, we know that education is a predictor of many things, such as income, life quality, and so on. It's also a predictor of longevity. The question that I raise in this regard is what happens when people who are unable to use their preferred language in an educational setting, that negatively impacts on their educational performance, and does that impact down the track their longevity? I couple that with observations about the role of educational institutions as sites of violence against linguistically minoritized populations. So, some of the most stark examples of this would be in the Canadian boarding schools, which were sites of mass killing for Indigenous children, and also sites of violence against those same people for using their Indigenous languages. So one incident I was reading about recently was where a young Indigenous person was punished for speaking their Indigenous language by having a pin stuck through their tongue so that they couldn't withdraw their tongue into their mouth, they couldn't speak, and they were made to hold that position for a length of time and to promise to only speak English. So again, bringing together those forms of like direct, immediate bodily violence with more diffuse forms of violence. I'll talk a little bit more of this later down the track. So education, healthcare. What are the impacts of not being able to use your preferred language in a healthcare situation, in situations of acute and chronic health? We saw a lot of this emerge during the pandemic, for example. So with the communities that I worked with in Tibet, These are languages which are completely shut out from all state-sponsored institutions. None of their languages are represented in government documents, planning, institutions, funding, etc. So when the government was producing health information during the pandemic, none of that information was made available to these Tibetans in the language that they preferred. What are the life expectancy impacts of that? How do they combine with the educational impacts? Another system is the justice system or the injustice system. What does it mean to have an encounter with a police officer who doesn't who doesn't communicate with you in your preferred language? How does that expose people to greater risk of violence and death? How does that make it more likely for them to end up in the court system and the prison system? How do those risks impact their life expectancy overall? And then the final area that I look at is emergency services. So thinking about a fire, a flood, an earthquake, all of these situations require the rapid dissemination of accurate and timely information so that people can make the best decisions in order to save themselves, basically. And we see in this kind of situation the presence of what's being called disaster linguicism. So exposing linguistic minorities to greater chances of death in this acute emergency crisis type situation. And so in the article, what I argue is that when we take all these factors together, when we look at the way a particular person speaking a minoritized language would be shut out of all of those institutions and subject to chronic discrimination, leading to poor health and premature death and so on. I argue that this kind of linguistic inequality creates what Achille Mbembe calls death worlds, forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. And so, a lot of my work has looked at the global crisis of linguistic diversity, the fact that we stand poised to probably have half as many languages as we have now by the time we enter into the next century. And I think about all of those people speaking those thousands of languages, essentially abandoned by the state. All of those people are currently living in these kind of linguistic death worlds. So that was back in 2022. And an interesting thing that happened to me at that time was that I found out that I'm autistic. And when I got that diagnosis, it was just after I'd published that article. And I'd been thinking about death and inequality for a long time. I had some basic understanding of autism as a form of difference that exists in a condition of inequality. And when I got that diagnosis, I thought to myself, you know what, I think if I Google autism and life expectancy, I'm going to find something unpleasant. And I did. So autistic people in a number of studies have been shown to have a lower life expectancy. So in Australia, official government statistics relating to the preparation of a draft autism strategy found that autistic people in Australia live 20 years, they died 20 years earlier than the non-autistic population. So allistic is non-autistic. So that 20 years figure, I think, is probably an artifact of the data. There's more recent studies showing that comparative studies in a number of contexts show that the death gap is probably somewhere around 7 years, something like that. But nonetheless, that there is a definite death gap between autistic and non-autistic people. And so having just been thinking about death and language, I started thinking about these things in relation to myself, which is not something that I was expecting to be doing when I began this research. So autism is a neurological difference which is characterized a large part of it is characterized by a difference in communication styles. It's a highly divergent communication style from population around them. So in technical psychological terms, the diagnostic criteria refers to it as communicative and social deficits. I don't use the deficit language. I don't think it's deficit. I think it's divergent. It's different. But communicating differently is a core feature of autism. So I started to think about, well, could the way that autistic people communicate be related in some way to that premature death that autistic people experience? And I sort of wrote up some preliminary thoughts about this earlier on in the year in this article, blog post called I'm Dying to Speak to You, where I basically argued that autistic communication styles typically mark autistic people out for violence from the non-autistic population. So autistic people start off early in life being targets for bullying, and then throughout the rest of our lives are subjected to much higher rates of various forms of interpersonal violence than the non-autistic population, leading to what people who study this call polyvictimization. That is linked to chronic stress, which would have all the health impacts, which I was mentioning before. And since one of the leading causes of death amongst autistic people is suicide, I think that this sort of there's a chain linking divergent communication styles, violence, stress, suicide, and premature death. So just to give you a very quick example of what this looks like in practice, this on the right-hand side is an excerpt from Harold Garfinkel's Studies in Ethnomethodology, where he did these experiments where, well, he got his students to go out and deliberately contravene social norms and to report on what happened to them. And a lot of the experiments, they would do things like they would go and stand too close to the person that they were speaking to, and they had to like give up the experiments because they were getting sort of beaten and insulted and chased off for contravening these unspoken social norms. So you can see on the right-hand side this conversation where, hi Ray, how's your girlfriend going? What do you mean, how is she feeling? Do you mean physically or mental? So the E is the experimenter, where they're pushing for this additional information which should be assumed. And the other person who doesn't know that they're being experimented on reacts with this hostility, and in the end says, what's the matter with you? Are you sick? And the thing that's interesting about this for me is that this is like a very typical conversational experience for me as an autistic person, where one of the communicative differences that autistic people have is the constant heightened drive for clarity, right? And a sort of less shared assumed social knowledge in communicative contexts. And so in this kind of situation, if I was saying this, I would just be wanting to know what people mean, and I would continue asking these questions. And that's often taken as some kind of like threat or assault. And that's because a lot of the autistic communicative practice mirrors sort of the pragmatics of impoliteness in English language context. So I think that there's a link between that kind of pragmatic rupture and the violence that autistic people experience and our premature death. So I'm already at half an hour, but I just want to sort of talk about sort of what I think we need to think about in order to extend this program of looking at links between language and death, because I think it's a fruitful and important line of research. I think that there are many different populations that we need to look at and think about, many different contexts where we need to tease out these relationships between language and death. So one thing that we need to rethink to pursue this line of thought is to rethink the body. So we know from Buchholz and Hall's work on embodied sociolinguistics, they have this great passage where they talk about the body being a dialogic product. It is co-constructed in the back and forth of speakers and hearers. And that's essentially what I'm talking about here. The way that the dialogic construction of the body through language can be harmful for some people. So in their work, Buchholz and Hall really center agency in the embodied sociolinguistics. The proposal that I'm making in the way that I approach these issues is to look more at structure. So as an anthropologist, I'm one of the people that I draw inspiration from is Sherry Ortner and her work on dark anthropology, which sort of compels us to look at these structural side of life and the way that it harms people. And so I think we need sort of a version of that for embodied sociolinguistics. Some of the people that I think might help us do this are Judith Butler. So Buchholz and Hall, they draw on Butler's work, but they draw on her earlier work on gender and the body. Butler's work after that takes a turn to looking at biopolitics in her work, Frames of War, Precarious Life, and the Strength of the Force of Nonviolence. This is kind of her biopolitical trilogy, where she talks about the social ontology of the body and ties it to state violence. So I think that that's one way that we can rethink the body and language. Another one is Benjamin Mikes, who is a genocide studies scholar, and he has this article on the loss of death, where he talks about the material nature of symbolic injuries, right? And I would include in that symbolic injury through language. He talks about the way that symbolic injuries, disrespect, and so on impact the brain, lead to changes in the body, and so on. So I think we can think about language in this way as well, language and its material harms. But I also think here, following Sarah Ahmed, that we need to think about also restorative, reparative, healing ways of using language. If language can physically harm the body by causing chronic stress, then the absence of that language can also heal the body. We need to think about language as a healthcare system as well as a system of harm. Second one is rethinking death. So there's been a lot of sort of reconceptualizing death in a number of disciplines to take it away from death as an event to death as kind of like a probabilistic attribute of a particular kind of life, right? If you're born in this country versus that country, you've got a greater chance of dying. If you're born as this type of person versus that type of person, what are the different ways in which, you know, differential amount quantities of death diffuse our particular situated lives? So some of the earliest work on this was done by Engels back in 1845. His idea of social murder, the working class being killed before their time by the conditions that they were forced to live in. This concept has sort of had a bit of a renaissance since the Grenfell disaster a couple of years ago. Slow violence is another one, looking at environmental pollutants and so on, the way that they carry out violence over time in ways that aren't necessarily visible. Lauren Balent also wrote about slow death. We have genocide studies, people looking at this as well, genocide by attrition. Different ways essentially of looking at violence and death as things that happen gradually, slowly, structurally, that are not necessarily immediately visible in the sort of that stark, striking, visible death that I started talking about at the beginning, the self-immolation protests. So I think to understand the relationship between language and death, we need to rethink the body, we need to rethink death. And the third thing that I would say is that we also need to bring in a new and critical reconsideration of the role of the state related to language. I would say that, you know, sociolinguistics, applied linguistics has largely followed broader trends in the humanities and social sciences as seeing kind of sovereignty and the state as being of reduced importance. I'm thinking about the work of people like Wendy Brown or Antonio Negri, sort of saying we're living in a post-sovereign world. Everything is about the flow of capital. States don't really matter anymore. In some of my more recent work, I've been looking at the fact that I think we have very good reason to reconsider this. I think we're living in a historical moment where the state is reascendant, where the power of sovereignty is reascendant. And I think this trend is going to continue in the future. And if I'm correct in the way that I'm theorizing the relationship between language and death, and its linked to sovereignty in the state, I think we're going to be seeing more of this kind of diffuse, but also acute forms of death through language meted out to marginalized populations in the coming years. And so I think that this is something that we need to be alert to if we care about more than language, if we care about the people that we study and work with and work for. I think this is something that demands our attention. So I will finish there. Questions, comments, I welcome the discussion and look forward to chatting with you. Yep, thanks.
Wow.
It's always very weird on Teams. You end up talking to yourself. I couldn't see anyone. So it's nice to see faces again.
Great. Thank you very much. We're just gonna, should we stop the recording? Is that, yeah. Thank you very much, Gerald, for this amazing talk.